At 2 a.m. in a quiet California suburb, Navy SEAL Julian was abruptly woken up. His rescue German Shepherd, Duke, wasn't barking. He was standing by the back gate, letting out a low, vibrating growl. When Julian followed him into the dark alley, Duke started frantically scratching at a heavy city manhole cover. Julian knelt down, placing his ear against the cold, dirty iron. He didn't hear running water. He heard the deep, rhythmic hum of heavy machinery and the violent grinding of concrete. Someone was digging a massive underground tunnel right beneath their peaceful street, and Julian was about to find out exactly where it led. Before we dive in, let us know in the comments which country you are watching from. And if you love stories that melt your heart, please subscribe to support our channel. Julian dropped his heavy canvas duffel bag onto the hardwood floor of his living room. The dull thud echoed through the empty house. He stood completely still for a moment, letting his eyes adjust to the dim light filtering through the blinds. He was 34 years old, an active-duty Navy SEAL. He had short dark hair, sharp features, and eyes that constantly scanned his surroundings for potential threats out of pure, ingrained habit. Outside his window, the San Diego suburb looked impossibly peaceful. Sprinklers hissed rhythmically over green lawns. A neighbor across the street slowly washed a minivan. Children rode bicycles down the sidewalk, their laughter carrying on the warm breeze. Julian watched them, feeling entirely out of place. The contrast between the chaotic, violent combat zones he had just left and this overwhelming suburban quiet felt abrasive. He had lost good men on his last deployment. Coming back to a world where the biggest problem was a brown patch of grass felt deeply alienating. He needed an anchor, something to bridge the gap between his two realities. The next morning, Julian drove his battered black pickup truck to the County Animal Rescue Center. He walked through the sterile corridors, past rows of chain-link cages. Dogs of all sizes barked and jumped against the wire, desperate for attention. Julian walked past them without stopping. He did not want an energetic pet. He wanted a companion who understood the weight of silence. At the very end of the facility, in an isolated enclosure, he found what he was looking for. Inside sat a large German Shepherd. The dog had a scarred muzzle and the tip of his left ear was missing. He did not bark, he did not pace. He simply sat perfectly still and watched Julian approach with intelligent amber eyes. A shelter worker, a young woman named Sarah, wearing a faded green apron, walked up beside Julian. She looked at the dog with a mixture of respect and sadness. "His name is Duke," Sarah explained. "He is a retired military K-9. He served 2 combat tours overseas before sustaining an injury to his leg. He is highly trained, but most families find him far too intense. He does not play fetch. He patrols." Julian looked at Duke. Duke looked back. Julian recognized the familiar coiled tension in the dog's posture. He saw a fellow soldier who had seen the worst of the world and now found himself locked in a cage, unable to turn off his instincts. Julian knelt down, so he was at eye level with the animal. He did not reach his hand through the fence. He simply offered his presence. Duke slowly stepped forward, sniffed the air near Julian's face, and let out a soft huff of breath. "I will take him," Julian said, standing up. Sarah looked surprised but quickly nodded. "I have to warn you. He needs a strong leader. He needs structure." "Structure is all I know," Julian replied. The transition to living together was seamless. Duke did not act like a normal house pet. He never begged for food from the table. He never chewed on the furniture. Instead, he established a strict perimeter. Twice a day, Duke walked the entire boundary of the backyard, sniffing the base of the wooden fence, checking for any disturbances. At night, he slept on a small rug directly next to Julian's bed, his body always positioned to face the bedroom door. Julian respected the dog's rigid boundaries. They communicated mostly without words, relying on subtle physical gestures. A sharp tilt of Julian's head meant it was time to eat. 2 taps on his own thigh meant Julian was going out to the truck. They quickly found a shared rhythm. The quiet, empty house felt far less isolating with Duke around. For the first time in months, Julian started to sleep through the night. The recurring nightmares of gunfire and shouting faded slightly when he could reach down and feel the warm, steady breathing of the German Shepherd sleeping nearby. They were 2 veterans, finding peace in each other's quiet company. Exactly 1 week after Julian brought Duke home, that fragile peace broke. It was Thursday night. The digital clock on the nightstand read exactly 2 in the morning. Julian woke up instantly. Years of combat training had conditioned him to be an incredibly light sleeper. The house was completely silent, but the atmosphere had shifted. Something was different. He looked down at the rug next to his bed. It was empty. Duke was not there. Julian silently rolled out of bed. He grabbed a heavy tactical flashlight from the nightstand. He moved swiftly through the dark hallway, his bare feet making absolutely no sound on the floorboards. He found Duke standing by the back door in the kitchen. The dog's ears were pinned flat against his skull. The thick hair along his spine stood straight up. Duke let out a low, vibrating growl from deep within his chest. He stared intensely at the solid wood of the door, his body rigid. "What is it, buddy?" Julian whispered, keeping his voice calm and steady. Duke did not look away from the door. He lifted his right paw and scratched urgently at the doorframe. Julian nodded. He turned the brass deadbolt and slowly opened the door. Duke immediately slipped out into the backyard. Julian followed, gripping the flashlight tightly. The cool night air hit his face. The neighborhood was dead asleep. Streetlights cast long, pale shadows across the manicured lawns. Duke did not stop to sniff the grass or mark his territory. He moved with total, aggressive purpose toward the tall wooden gate at the very back of the property. The gate led out to a narrow paved alleyway that ran behind the houses, separating Julian's street from the next block over. Duke whined softly and pressed his black nose against the narrow gap between the wooden planks of the gate. Julian stepped forward and silently unlatched the heavy metal lock. The alley was dark and smelled faintly of damp garbage. Plastic trash cans lined the fences on both sides. Duke trotted straight out to the center of the asphalt, moving about 20 yards down the lane. He stopped abruptly over a large, heavy iron manhole cover. It was a standard access point for the city's storm drain system, surrounded by cracked pavement. Duke lowered his head. He sniffed the rusty, dirt-filled edges of the heavy iron disc. Then he began to dig. His thick claws scraped violently against the solid metal and the surrounding asphalt. The harsh sound echoed loudly in the quiet night. He growled again, a deep, menacing sound that sent a chill down Julian's spine. Julian walked over and knelt carefully beside the dog. He placed a firm hand on Duke's broad back. The dog's muscles were tight, trembling with adrenaline. Julian shone his flashlight over the manhole cover. It looked completely normal. It was covered in years of accumulated grime, identical to thousands of others across the city. But Julian trusted his partner. Dogs trained at Duke's level did not give false alarms. They did not attack inanimate objects without a very specific reason. Julian turned off his flashlight to avoid drawing attention. He placed his ear just inches from the cold, dirty metal of the manhole cover. He closed his eyes, tuned out the rustling of the wind, and listened closely. At first, he heard nothing but the distant, rhythmic hum of highway traffic miles away. He waited patiently. Then he felt it, a faint, rhythmic vibration. It pulsed faintly through the iron disc and into the ground beneath his knees. It was mechanical, deliberate. Something was moving deep down there in the dark. Julian stood up slowly. He looked up and down the dark, empty alley, his eyes narrowing. The comforting illusion of the peaceful suburb was completely gone. His military instincts, dormant for exactly 1 week, flared back to life. He tapped his thigh twice. Duke immediately stopped scratching and sat at attention. They both stared down at the iron cover, knowing the real war had somehow followed them home. Julian stayed on his knees next to the manhole cover for several long minutes. The vibration slowly faded away, leaving only the cold silence of the alley. Duke stopped scratching. The German shepherd sat back on his haunches, but kept his gaze locked on the heavy iron disc. Julian reached out and rubbed the thick fur behind the dog's ears. He did not try to pry the cover open. Doing so blindly in the middle of the night without backup or proper equipment violated every tactical rule he knew. He needed intelligence first. "Let us go back inside," Julian whispered. He tapped his thigh twice. Duke hesitated for a fraction of a second before obeying the command. They retreated through the wooden gate, and Julian locked it securely behind them. Back inside the house, Julian did not return to sleep. He walked into the kitchen, opened a drawer, and pulled out a small black notebook and a pen. He sat at the kitchen table in the dark. He wrote down the date, the exact time of the disturbance, the location, and Duke's specific reactions. This was his military training taking over. A single anomaly was just an event. A repeated anomaly was a pattern. He needed to figure out if this was a pattern. The next morning, the San Diego sun bathed the neighborhood in bright, cheerful light. Julian poured himself a cup of black coffee and walked out to the backyard. The alley gate looked exactly as it had the night before. He opened it and stepped out into the daylight. The manhole cover sat undisturbed in the center of the asphalt. A thin layer of dirt and dried leaves covered the edges. It looked completely ordinary. No normal person walking past would give it a second look. Julian spent the weekend transforming his upstairs spare bedroom into a covert observation post. The window in that room offered a clear, unobstructed view of the alley and the street beyond it. He set up a high-powered spotting scope on a tripod, positioning it deep inside the room so the lens would not reflect the incoming sunlight. He kept the blinds drawn, leaving only a narrow slit open for observation. Monday brought the regular rhythm of suburban life. Garbage trucks rumbled down the street. Kids walked to the nearby elementary school. Mr. Henderson, an elderly man who lived 3 houses down, slowly watered his rose bushes. Julian watched it all through the scope, logging the normal baseline activity of the neighborhood. He needed to know exactly what normal looked like so he could spot the abnormal. Tuesday afternoon provided the first piece of the puzzle. At exactly 3 o'clock, a white panel delivery truck turned onto the street. It had no company logos, no phone numbers, and no distinguishing marks on the side panels. The driver was a heavily built man wearing a dark baseball cap pulled low over his face. He parked the truck near the entrance of the alley. The man did not get out to deliver a package. He simply sat in the driver's seat with the engine idling. 10 minutes later, he drove away. Julian wrote down the license plate number, the vehicle description, and the time in his notebook. Wednesday saw a similar event. A different unmarked white truck parked on the opposite side of the alley entrance. This time, the driver stayed for 15 minutes before pulling away. They were not making deliveries. They were establishing a presence. They were conducting their own surveillance. Julian recognized the tactic immediately. They were securing the perimeter. Duke sensed the shift in Julian's demeanor. The dog stopped his relaxed patrols of the backyard. He spent most of his time sitting at the base of the stairs, staring up at the closed door of the spare bedroom where Julian worked. The bond between them grew stronger through this shared vigilance. They were no longer just a veteran and a rescue dog living in the same house. They were a 2-operator team running a covert mission. Thursday approached with a heavy sense of anticipation. Julian spent the evening cleaning his sidearm, a matte black pistol he kept locked in a biometric safe. He did not plan to use it, but he felt better knowing it was ready and fully functional. He went to bed at midnight but did not sleep. He lay on top of the covers, fully dressed in dark clothing, waiting. Duke rested on his rug, his eyes closed but his ears constantly twitching. The digital clock rolled over to 1:45 in the morning. Julian sat up. Duke opened his eyes and lifted his head. The air in the house felt thick and heavy. They waited in total silence. At exactly 2 in the morning, Duke stood up. He let out the same low, vibrating growl from deep within his chest. His hackles rose. He walked purposefully out of the bedroom and headed straight for the back door. Julian followed closely behind. He grabbed his tactical flashlight and a pair of thick leather gloves. He opened the back door, and Duke slipped out into the cool night air. The dog did not hesitate. He went straight to the wooden gate and pushed his nose against the narrow gap. Julian unlatched the gate. They stepped out into the alley. The neighborhood was dead quiet, wrapped in a thick blanket of darkness. Duke trotted directly to the iron manhole cover. This time, he did not scratch at the metal. He simply stood over it, his body rigid, staring down at the ground. Julian knelt beside the dog. He put on the heavy leather gloves. He did not turn on the flashlight. He leaned down and placed his ear flat against the cold, gritty surface of the iron disc. He closed his eyes and concentrated. The distant highway noise faded into the background. He focused entirely on the ground beneath him. Then he heard it. It was much clearer than the previous week. It was a suppressed, heavy mechanical sound. It sounded like a massive generator or a heavy-duty ventilation system running deep underground. The vibration pulsed steadily through the iron, matching the exact rhythm of a heartbeat. Underneath the mechanical hum, Julian heard something else. It was faint, muffled by layers of dirt and concrete, but unmistakable. It sounded like the scraping of heavy metal against stone. Julian opened his eyes. He looked down at the manhole cover. The city's storm drains were not designed to house heavy machinery. They were not designed to accommodate construction equipment. Something massive was happening right under the feet of his sleeping neighbors, and whoever was doing it had gone to great lengths to keep it completely hidden. Julian pulled his head back. He looked at Duke. The German Shepherd stared back, his amber eyes shining faintly in the ambient light. The dog had done his job. He had found the target. Now it was up to Julian to figure out what to do about it. Julian stood up slowly. He pulled a small piece of white chalk from his pocket. He made a tiny, almost invisible mark on the edge of the manhole cover and another matching mark on the concrete rim. If anyone moved the cover, even an inch, he would know immediately. He tapped his thigh twice. Duke turned and walked back toward the gate. Julian followed, his mind racing through tactical possibilities. He could not call the local police. He had no solid proof of a crime, only a barking dog and some strange noises. The police would dismiss him as a paranoid veteran. He needed hard evidence. He needed eyes inside that tunnel. As he locked the wooden gate behind them, Julian made a firm decision. He was going to breach the manhole. He was going to find out exactly what was hiding in the dark below his street. Julian did not sleep the rest of Thursday night. He sat in the dark living room, his mind calculating variables. He needed visual confirmation of whatever existed under the alley. Brute force was out of the question. Lifting the heavy iron cover would create noise, and noise meant losing the element of surprise. He needed to look inside without breaking the seal. Friday morning arrived with gray clouds and a cool breeze. Julian went to his garage. He unlocked a heavy steel storage locker, bolted to the concrete floor. Inside lay the remnants of his operational life. He bypassed the weapons and reached for a black Pelican case on the bottom shelf. He carried the case to the kitchen table and snapped open the latches. Inside rested a high-definition fiber-optic borescope. It was a specialized piece of tactical equipment. The camera head was smaller than a fingernail, attached to a flexible, 3-meter-long reinforced cable. It connected to a ruggedized digital monitor. The device could see in absolute darkness using infrared light. It could snake under doors, through cracked walls, and down ventilation shafts. Julian charged the monitor battery. He checked the cable for any signs of wear. He tested the infrared output in the dark hallway. Everything worked perfectly. Duke watched the entire process from his rug. The German Shepherd recognized the equipment. He knew the smell of the Pelican case and the intense focus in Julian's eyes. The dog sat up straight, his ears perked, fully engaged in the preparation. Julian waited for the neighborhood to fall completely asleep. He needed the deepest part of the night, the hour when human activity dropped to absolute zero. At 2 a.m, he dressed in dark gray clothing. He secured the borescope monitor to his left forearm using thick Velcro straps. He coiled the flexible camera cable and clipped it to his belt. He pulled on a pair of thin tactical gloves. He looked at Duke. He gave a single sharp hand signal. The dog immediately fell into a strict heel position at Julian's left leg. They moved through the back door and out into the yard. The air felt heavy and damp. Julian unlatched the wooden gate. They stepped into the alley. Julian tapped Duke's shoulder and pointed to the far end of the alley. "Watch," Julian whispered. Duke understood instantly. The dog trotted silently to a position 10 yards away. He sat down in the shadows near a large green dumpster. He faced outward, his eyes scanning the dark street, his ears swiveling to catch the slightest sound. He became a living perimeter alarm. No one could approach from the north without Duke alerting Julian. If anyone approached from the south, Julian would see them himself. The 2-operator team was officially deployed. Julian crouched next to the manhole cover. He did not use his flashlight. His eyes had fully adjusted to the ambient darkness. He ran his gloved fingers along the gritty edge of the iron disc. City manhole covers usually featured small pry holes near the outer rim, designed for heavy lifting hooks. He found one easily. It was blocked with years of compacted dirt and small pebbles. Julian pulled a thin steel pick from his pocket. He carefully scraped the dirt out of the pry hole, working slowly to avoid making any scraping noises. He caught the loose debris in his left hand and placed it quietly on the asphalt. After 10 minutes of meticulous work, he cleared a small, cylindrical gap that went straight down into the darkness below. He unclipped the borescope cable from his belt. He pressed the power button on the forearm monitor. The small screen glowed with a faint green tactical light. Julian adjusted his sleeve to shield the glow from the rest of the alley. He fed the tiny camera head into the cleared pry hole. The cable slid down smoothly. 5 inches, 10 inches. Julian watched the monitor. At first, the screen showed only the rough, rusted interior of the iron hole. Then, the camera breached the bottom of the cover. The screen went completely black. The space below was vast and swallowed the ambient light. Julian reached to the control panel on his wrist. He activated the infrared illuminator. The screen flickered for a fraction of a second before the image resolved into sharp, high-contrast black and white. Julian held his breath. He expected to see damp concrete walls, pooling stagnant water, and piles of rotting garbage. He expected the typical decay of a city storm drain. He saw none of that. The camera hung 3 feet below the ceiling of a massive underground tunnel. The walls were not slick with slime. They were lined with thick, corrugated steel panels. The panels looked newly installed. The floor was completely dry and leveled with crushed gravel. Julian manipulated the thumbstick on his monitor to rotate the camera lens. He panned the view to the right. A set of thick electrical cables ran securely along the wall, held in place by heavy-duty metal brackets. The cables fed a row of industrial light fixtures, currently powered off. Julian zoomed in on the wall structure. Someone had painted precise, reflective tactical symbols on the steel panels. He recognized the markers immediately. They were distance and directional indicators, designed to be read through night vision goggles. He angled the camera straight down at the gravel floor. The infrared light highlighted deep, unmistakable impressions in the dirt. They were track marks. They did not belong to regular truck tires. They belonged to heavy tracked construction vehicles. Julian felt a cold wave of realization wash over him. This was not a smuggler's stash. This was not a simple hideout. Someone had engineered a sophisticated, high-load logistics route directly underneath the neighborhood. The engineering required to build this without collapsing the street above or alerting the city authorities was staggering. It required massive funding, military-grade planning, and strict operational security. The reflective symbols confirmed his worst fears. These were not ordinary criminals. These people operated with a military mindset. They used standard operating procedures for subterranean navigation. Duke let out a very soft, almost inaudible whine from his position by the dumpster. Julian looked up from the monitor instantly. The German shepherd remained perfectly still, but his body language screamed caution. His ears locked onto the far end of the street, pointing north. Someone or something was moving in the distance, outside of Julian's line of sight, but well within the dog's acoustic range. Julian did not hesitate. He immediately killed the power to the borescope monitor. The faint green glow vanished, plunging him back into absolute darkness. He gripped the fiber optic cable and pulled it smoothly up through the pry hole. He coiled the wire with practiced speed and clipped it securely back to his tactical belt. He scooped up the small pile of dirt he had excavated and scattered it softly into the nearby grass. He gave a sharp double tap on his thigh. Duke abandoned his post immediately, moving like a shadow across the asphalt. Julian opened the wooden gate, let the dog slip through, and followed him inside. He secured the heavy metal latch silently. They stood in the dark backyard listening. 2 minutes later, a slow-moving vehicle rolled past the alley entrance. It sounded like another heavy panel truck. It did not stop, but its presence confirmed the threat. The perimeter was being actively monitored. Julian now knew exactly what he was up against. The war was literally under his feet. Julian locked the wooden gate and walked back into the house. He did not turn on any lights. He moved straight to his laptop on the kitchen table. He connected the borescope monitor via a USB cable and downloaded the short video clip he had managed to capture. The transfer took only a few seconds. Julian spent the next 3 days gathering critical data. He established a strict daily routine. During the daylight hours, he watched the alley from the upstairs spare bedroom. He logged every single vehicle that drove past his house, noting license plates, vehicle makes, and specific models in his black notebook. The unmarked white panel trucks appeared twice a day, always briefly, always just sitting and idling at the ends of the street. They maintained a textbook security perimeter. At night, between 2 and 3 in the morning, Julian and Duke returned to the alley. Duke took his position by the dumpster, guarding the perimeter. Julian cleared the pry hole, dropped the camera cable, and recorded everything he could see in the tunnel below. He became intimately familiar with the subterranean space. He captured footage of different sections of the tunnel as the camera angled in various directions. He saw the reflective tactical symbols clearly. He identified them as specific distance markers and directional chevrons used exclusively by military combat engineers. He also recorded the movement of equipment, He saw heavy-duty cargo sleds pulled by small, battery-powered electric tractors. The vehicles made very little noise, which explained the low mechanical hum that barely reached the street above. On Sunday afternoon, Julian turned his dining room into a secure war room. He pushed the heavy wooden table against the wall and taped a large, detailed city map to the drywall. He printed out high-resolution screen grabs from his borescope footage. He pinned the photos to the map, using colored string to connect the tactical symbols to their corresponding real-world locations. Duke lay on the hardwood floor nearby, systematically chewing on a heavy black rubber toy. The dog kept one amber eye on Julian at all times, clearly sensing the building intensity and focus radiating across the room. Julian opened a separate laptop window and accessed public city engineering records. He downloaded the digital blueprints for the local stormwater drainage system. He overlaid a transparent printed copy of the city pipes directly onto his physical map. The official blueprints showed a main drainage pipe running straight down his alley. According to the city plans, the pipe continued south for 3 voet before emptying into a municipal water treatment facility near the bay. Julian looked closely at his printed photos. The tactical chevrons painted on the steel tunnel panels pointed exactly in the opposite direction. The heavy equipment sleds traveled north. Whoever built this tunnel had hijacked a section of the city infrastructure and then started digging their own distinct path in the complete opposite direction. Julian grabbed a thick red marker. He drew a solid line from his alley, heading straight north. He factored in the specific distance markers he had seen on the tunnel walls. The markers indicated a total travel distance of at least 2 miles from his current location. He followed the red line up the paper map. 2 miles north of his quiet suburban neighborhood sat a massive, brutalist concrete complex surrounded by high walls and razor wire. The map simply labeled it as a federal data processing annex. Julian knew better. During his last overseas deployment, he had read classified intelligence briefings that originated directly from that exact facility. It was not a simple civilian processing center. It was a highly restricted regional hub for defense intelligence. It housed secure servers containing classified satellite imagery, covert operative rosters, and encrypted military communication keys. Julian stared at the red line intersecting the federal facility. His pulse quickened. The pieces snapped together with terrifying clarity. The criminals below were not smuggling drugs or illegal weapons. They were staging a massive physical breach of a secure government server farm. They were digging a tunnel straight into the foundation of a federal intelligence hub. He needed more proof. He needed to see exactly what they were transporting on those sleds. That night, Julian and Duke went out to the alley earlier than usual. They positioned themselves at 1:30 in the morning. Julian dropped the camera down the hole and waited in the silent dark. At exactly 2:15, the familiar low hum vibrated through the iron cover. Julian watched the green screen on his wrist monitor. An electric tractor rolled into view. It pulled 2 heavily loaded cargo sleds. Julian zoomed the digital camera lens to maximum magnification. The sleds carried large wooden crates stamped with international shipping codes. Next to the crates sat specialized construction equipment. Julian immediately recognized a heavy-duty diamond-tipped core drill. Beside the massive drill lay thick spools of military-grade fiber-optic cable. This was the exact operational equipment needed to bore through reinforced concrete foundations and tap directly into secure data lines. The tractor stopped directly beneath Julian. 2 men stepped into the camera frame. They wore dark gray tactical uniforms with no visible insignia. They wore heavy dust masks and bright headlamps. Julian could not see their faces, but he recognized the way they moved. They moved with disciplined, coordinated precision. They communicated efficiently, with sharp hand signals. They were highly trained professional operators. One man checked a ruggedized digital tablet. He pointed a gloved finger north. The other man nodded, climbed back onto the electric tractor, and engaged the motor. The sleds rolled forward smoothly, disappearing down the long tunnel toward the federal facility. Julian pulled the camera cable up. He packed his equipment quickly and silently. He tapped his thigh. Duke fell into step beside him. They returned to the house and locked the back door. Julian stood still in the dark kitchen. He had his proof. The threat was absolutely real, and it was imminent. The diamond core drill meant they were preparing to breach the facility foundation very soon. Calling the local police would trigger a massive, uncoordinated response. The operators below would simply detonate the tunnel and disappear, destroying the evidence and likely collapsing the entire residential street above. He needed to get the tactical data directly to his commanders at Naval Special Warfare Command. However, a few blurry photos of a construction drill and a printed map covered in red lines would never be enough to mobilize a full federal strike team. He needed absolute, irrefutable evidence. He needed actual faces, confirmed identities, and concrete digital proof of the final target. He looked down at Duke. The German Shepherd looked up, his tail giving a single solid wag in the dark. "We have to go down there," Julian said quietly. He walked to his garage and unlocked the heavy steel storage locker again. This time he did not reach for the camera equipment. He reached for his tactical body armor, his suppressed sidearm, and a combat knife. He pulled out a specialized K9 tactical harness equipped with a sturdy handle and silent attachment points. He was going to breach the tunnel. He was going to follow the red line all the way to the end. Julian knew the clock was ticking. The presence of the diamond core drill on the cargo sled meant the breach could happen tonight. He could not wait for morning. He walked into his garage and opened the heavy steel storage locker. He pulled out a black tactical vest, adjusting the heavy straps over his dark shirt. He attached a suppressed pistol to his right hip holster. He grabbed a fixed-blade combat knife and secured the sheath directly to his chest rig. He checked his spare magazines, ensuring each one was fully loaded. He turned to Duke. He held up a specialized black nylon tactical harness. Duke stepped forward immediately. The German Shepherd, a massive dog with a scarred muzzle and amber eyes, stood perfectly still as Julian buckled the heavy harness around his chest and torso. The harness featured a rigid lifting handle on the back and silent, padded attachment points. "We are going to work," Julian whispered. They left the house through the back door. Julian did not use the alley behind his house. The enemy watched that specific entry point too closely. He needed a completely different door into the underground system. He pulled up the city sewer map on his secure tablet. He traced the main drainage line south, navigating away from his residential neighborhood until the blue line intersected with an abandoned industrial sector near the old train tracks. Julian drove his truck through the empty streets without headlights as he neared the target zone. He parked behind a decaying brick warehouse. Tall weeds grew aggressively through the cracked pavement of the parking lot. The night air smelled strongly of rust, salt water, and old chemicals. He stepped out of the truck. Duke jumped down beside him, landing silently on the concrete, instantly going on high alert. Julian located a large manhole cover hidden deep in the shadows of an overgrown loading dock. He used a solid steel pry bar. He lifted the heavy iron disc with a grunt of effort and slid it slowly to the side. A wave of cold, foul-smelling damp air rushed out of the dark hole. He looked at Duke. He pointed his finger down into the void. The dog did not hesitate. Julian lifted Duke firmly by the tactical harness handle and lowered the heavy animal down into the dark shaft. Once the dog reached the solid bottom, Julian climbed down the rusted iron ladder. He reached up and carefully pulled the manhole cover back into its original place, sealing them completely in the dark. Julian activated his panoramic night vision goggles. The pitch-black world instantly turned a sharp, glowing shade of green. They stood in a massive concrete drainage pipe. A shallow stream of stagnant foul water ran down the center channel. Julian tapped his leg once. Duke moved forward, immediately taking the point position. They walked in absolute silence for nearly 2 miles. The old city sewer felt suffocating and oppressive. Stagnant water dripped steadily from the cracked concrete ceiling, echoing loudly in the enclosed space. The curved walls leaned inward, covered in thick layers of accumulated grime and algae. Julian checked his illuminated wrist compass frequently. He navigated the complex labyrinth of intersecting pipes, moving steadily north toward his neighborhood and the hidden tunnel. An hour later, the environment drastically changed. The damp, decaying concrete walls abruptly ended. They stepped directly into the new artificially excavated tunnel Julian had seen on his camera. The floor smoothly transitioned from wet sludge to dry, tightly packed crushed gravel. Thick, heavy-duty steel pillars supported the carved ceiling. Duke suddenly stopped walking. The dog lowered his large head and froze perfectly still. His ears rotated forward, locking onto something ahead. Julian immediately halted his advance. He raised a closed fist. Duke did not move a single muscle. Julian knelt silently beside the dog. He looked closely at the open path ahead. His night vision goggles picked up a very faint, unnatural distortion in the air about 10 yards down the tunnel. He reached into his tactical pouch and pulled out a small aerosol can of fine marking dust. He sprayed a very short, controlled burst into the empty air. The tiny particles floated forward slowly and illuminated 3 distinct, horizontal laser beams crossing the width of the tunnel. They were completely invisible to the naked eye. Breaking even one beam would trigger a silent alarm to the operators further down the tunnel. Julian studied the defensive pattern carefully. The lowest beam sat exactly 6 inches off the gravel floor. The middle beam crossed tightly at waist height. The highest beam sat near the steel ceiling. He tapped Duke gently on the shoulder. He pressed his flat hand against the gravel. "Down," Julian commanded softly. Duke flattened his large, muscular body completely against the cold floor. Julian pointed a finger forward, then made a slow, sweeping motion. The German Shepherd understood the advanced tactical crawl command flawlessly. Duke dragged himself forward slowly on his belly. He slid smoothly under the lowest laser beam, clearing the deadly tripwire by mere inches. Once he reached the safe zone on the other side, the dog sat back up silently and waited for his partner. Julian took a slow, deep breath to calm his heart rate. He stepped carefully over the lowest beam, contorted his upper body backward, and ducked smoothly under the middle beam. He moved with the highly practiced, fluid motion of a veteran Tier 1 operator. He cleared the trap entirely without disturbing the settling dust in the air. They continued moving north. The tunnel grew significantly wider. The ambient air grew noticeably warmer. The low mechanical hum Julian had originally heard from the street above grew much louder, vibrating directly through the thick soles of his combat boots. Duke stopped again. This time, the dog did not freeze in place. He raised his wet nose to the warm air and let out a very faint, breathy whine. He smelled something specific. Julian smelled it too. It was the sharp, unmistakable odor of hot metal, burning oil, and pulverized concrete. They crept slowly around a wide, sweeping curve in the tunnel. The corrugated steel panels finally ended. The narrow tunnel opened up into a massive, heavily reinforced subterranean chamber. Julian pressed his back firmly against the cold dirt wall. He peeked cautiously around the rough edge of the curve. At the far end of the massive chamber stood a sheer, solid wall of reinforced concrete. It was not a normal city structure. It was the deep, armored foundation wall of the Federal Intelligence Complex. Bright industrial work lights illuminated the entire staging area. 3 men wearing gray tactical gear stood near the wall. They operated the massive diamond-tipped core drill Julian had tracked earlier. The spinning drill bit pressed aggressively against the Federal Foundation. A steady stream of pressurized water cooled the rapidly spinning diamond head, creating a thick, blinding cloud of white steam. The operators worked quickly and efficiently, communicating with sharp hand signals. They were carving a massive hole into the wall. They were only a few inches away from physically breaching the inner sanctum of the secure server farm. Julian pulled his head back into the dark shadows. He looked down at his partner. Duke watched him with absolute, unwavering focus, ready for the very next command. They had successfully navigated the maze. They had found the hidden lair. They had found the primary target. Now Julian needed to identify the leader of this operation before the drill broke through the final layer of concrete. He checked the loaded magazine of his pistol one last time. He took a slow, deep breath, preparing to move out of the dark and closer to the blinding light. Julian pressed his flat hand firmly against Duke's broad chest. He gave the silent, strict command to stay. The German Shepherd understood immediately. Duke sank low to the ground and backed into the deep shadows near the curved tunnel wall. His dark fur absorbed the minimal ambient light. He became completely invisible against the dirty concrete. He did not make a single sound. He simply watched Julian with glowing amber eyes, waiting for his next order. Julian drew his suppressed pistol from his hip holster. He moved forward alone into the massive underground staging area. He stepped carefully over the loose gravel. He used a highly specialized walking technique, placing the outer edge of his combat boot down first, then rolling his weight smoothly inward to avoid crunching the small stones. The deafening roar of the heavy diamond core drill masked any slight noises he might make. Thick white steam from the drill's cooling water system filled the massive chamber, creating a dense artificial fog that hung heavy in the air. The temperature was stifling. Julian moved methodically from one heavy steel support pillar to the next. He kept his body profile low and tight, closing the distance to the active work zone. He stopped behind a large stack of wooden supply crates labeled with generic civilian construction markings. He was now only 40 yards away from the massive concrete foundation of the federal facility. The three operators worked tirelessly in the glaring, harsh light of portable halogen work lamps. Julian needed their faces. He needed absolute, undeniable proof to send to his commanders. He holstered his pistol and unclipped a specialized digital optic device from his chest rig. The device resembled a thick, ruggedized smartphone, but it housed a military-grade telescopic lens and advanced thermal imaging sensors. He raised the optics slowly over the top edge of the wooden crate. He pressed the record button. He zoomed the digital lens in on the first operator. The man turned his head away from the drill to wipe thick sweat from his brow. Julian captured his face perfectly in high definition. He shifted his aim to the second man, then the third. He logged their facial features directly into his secure, encrypted local drive. The digital evidence was irrefutable, but visual proof was not enough. He needed to document their specific objective. He needed clear audio. Julian reached into another tactical pouch on his vest. He extracted a small, powerful directional microphone. He attached the receiver to the base port of his optic device and slipped a single wireless earpiece deep into his right ear. He pointed the microphone directly at the group of busy men. The advanced device instantly filtered out the deafening roar of the heavy drilling equipment and amplified the specific frequencies of human voices. "Keep the water pressure completely steady," the tallest operator commanded. He checked a ruggedized digital tablet in his hands. "The reinforced concrete is much thicker than the stolen blueprints indicated." "We are almost through the outer defensive shell," the second man replied loudly over the noise. He adjusted a heavy brass valve on the main water line. "We breached the secure server room in exactly 2 hours. We are right on schedule. Make sure the EMP charges are primed and ready for immediate deployment," the first man said. "Once we extract the primary hard drives, we blow the charges. We fry their entire secondary backup system. Then we detonate the main tunnel supports. The ocean water from the bay will flood this entire underground shaft in less than 10 minutes. It will wash away all our equipment and all our DNA." Julian listened to the conversation with grim, cold focus. They planned to steal the physical data drives, destroy the digital backups with an electromagnetic pulse, and deliberately collapse the tunnel to cover their tracks. The violent flooding would not just destroy the tunnel, it would completely undermine the structural integrity of the residential neighborhood sitting directly above the pipes. Thousands of innocent people slept in those houses right now. The destruction would be absolute and devastating. Suddenly, the heavy metal door of a portable command center swung open. The small temporary structure sat near the back corner of the staging area, constructed from retrofitted steel shipping containers. A sharp, blinding rectangle of bright white light spilled out onto the gravel floor. The three operators at the drill immediately stopped talking. They stood at strict, rigid attention. Someone very important was stepping out. Julian focused his optic lens on the open doorway. He adjusted the contrast dial quickly to cut through the intense glare. A man walked slowly down the short metal ramp. He moved with absolute, unquestionable authority. He wore a crisp, tailored black tactical uniform with absolutely no rank insignia or identifying patches. He appeared to be in his late 50s. He had broad shoulders, a thick chest, and short steel gray hair cut in a high and tight military fade. A deep, jagged scar ran violently down the right side of his rigid jawline. Julian stared through the glowing digital screen on his device. His breath caught sharply in his throat. His blood ran instantly cold, freezing his veins. He lowered the optic device slowly and looked with his own bare eyes, desperately hoping the digital camera had somehow distorted the image. It had not. The man standing confidently in the harsh halogen light was Captain Elias Thorne. Julian knew that face perfectly. He knew the specific shape of that jagged scar. Captain Thorne was his former commanding officer. 3 years ago, Julian stood on a dust tarmac and watched Thorne board a stealth helicopter for a highly classified extraction mission in the Middle East. Julian watched that exact same helicopter take a direct hit from an enemy surface-to-air missile. He saw the massive fireball light up the night sky. He saw the burning wreckage crash into the mountains. The Department of Defense officially declared Thorne dead in action. Julian had stood rigidly in the freezing, pouring rain at Arlington National Cemetery. He had saluted a closed, empty wooden casket, yet here he was. Thorne stood deep underground in California, breathing, walking, and actively orchestrating a massive, catastrophic attack on his own country. The sheer shock hit Julian like a physical, heavy blow to the chest. He gripped the rough edge of the wooden crate tightly to steady his shaking hands. The terrifying implications flooded his mind. Thorne had personally trained Julian. Thorne wrote the exact tactical field manuals that Julian followed every single day. The infiltration techniques, the perimeter defenses, the operational security protocols. Thorne knew them all flawlessly. He knew exactly how active Navy SEALs operated because he had physically forged them himself. Julian suddenly realized why the tunnel defenses were so incredibly sophisticated and flawless. He was not hunting a simple, unorganized group of criminal mercenaries. He was hunting his own brilliant, deadly mentor. Thorne turned his head slowly. He looked directly out into the dark tunnel. For a terrifying, heart-stopping second, Julian thought Thorne was looking right at him. Julian stared at Captain Thorne. The intense shock paralyzed him for a tiny fraction of a second. His controlled, steady breathing hitched. He took a sharp intake of air. That single tiny sound betrayed his position completely. 50 yards away, near the dark entrance of the tunnel, a perimeter guard stepped out of the deep shadows. The new guard was a heavily muscled man, wearing a dark tactical helmet and thick night vision goggles. He held a thick leather leash attached to a massive, brindle-colored English Mastiff. The Mastiff possessed an enormous blocky head and heavily corded chest muscles. The massive dog snapped its head toward Julian's exact hiding spot behind the wooden crates. It let out a deep, booming bark that echoed violently off the cold concrete walls. The element of total surprise vanished instantly. The guard dropped the heavy leather leash and pointed his tactical rifle directly at the wooden crates. The Mastiff charged forward. It covered the long distance with terrifying speed, its heavy paws pounding loudly against the loose gravel. Julian quickly drew his suppressed pistol, but the massive dog moved too fast and erratically. Before Julian could acquire a clean target, a dark blur shot out from the deep shadows near the curved tunnel wall. Duke struck the charging Mastiff like a speeding freight train. The brave German shepherd slammed his muscular shoulder directly into the larger dog's ribs. The brutal impact knocked the Mastiff completely off balance. The two heavy animals rolled violently across the sharp gravel in a furious, chaotic tangle of fur and teeth. Duke did not bark or growl. He fought with the absolute, lethal silence of a highly trained military canine. He dodged a vicious bite, lunged forward, and clamped his powerful jaws securely around the Mastiff's thick, muscular neck. Duke pinned the heavier animal firmly to the ground, neutralizing the immediate threat without killing the opposing dog. The human guard raised his rifle to shoot Duke. Julian did not hesitate. He lunged out from behind the protective crates, closing the gap in 3 rapid, aggressive strides. He slapped the hot rifle barrel upward just as the weapon fired. The loud gunshot shattered a bright halogen work light directly above them, showering the gravel with sharp glass. Julian stepped smoothly inside the guard's defensive reach. He drove his elbow brutally into the man's unprotected jaw. The heavy strike snapped the man's head back. The guard stumbled backward and dropped the heavy rifle. He recovered quickly, reached to his tactical belt, and pulled out a jagged combat knife. The man slashed wildly at Julian's chest. Julian expertly dodged the sharp blade. Julian watched the guard's eyes widen as he realized his knife attack had completely failed. Julian grabbed the man's extending wrist and twisted it sharply downward. The bone snapped loudly. The knife hit the floor with a metallic clatter. Julian quickly swept the man's legs out from under him, sending him crashing onto the hard gravel. Julian followed the takedown with a precise, heavy strike to the side of the man's temple. The guard collapsed heavily into the dirt, completely unconscious. The single gunshot echoed continuously through the massive underground chamber. The 3 busy operators working at the diamond core drill stopped immediately. They dropped their heavy tools and drew their sidearms. Captain Thorne turned sharply toward the sudden sound. His cold, calculating eyes locked directly onto Julian standing under the broken light fixture. Recognition flashed clearly across Thorne's scarred face. He looked genuinely surprised for the first time. Thorne did not yell orders to attack. He knew Julian's elite combat capabilities far too well. A prolonged gunfight would risk the entire objective. Thorne turned immediately back and rushed into the portable metal command center. He slammed his open hand down onto a large red emergency terminal mounted on the wall. Piercing red strobe lights instantly replaced the bright white work lamps. A loud mechanical warning siren blared continuously through the confined tunnel. Julian knew exactly what that alarm meant. Thorne had initiated the catastrophic flooding protocol early. He planned to destroy the evidence, kill Julian, and escape the underground facility simultaneously. The solid ground began to shake violently beneath their feet. Deep explosive charges detonated far behind the massive concrete foundation wall. The heavy explosions fractured the primary city water mains and opened a direct, massive path to the nearby ocean bay. Julian did not retreat immediately. He sprinted toward the unconscious guard lying in the dirt. He grabbed the ruggedized digital tablet attached to the man's tactical vest. Julian pulled a specialized decryption cable from his own gear. He plugged his device into the enemy tablet port, completely bypassing the basic security lock. He rapidly initiated the download for the entire operational blueprint file, the complete structural tunnel schematics, and the encrypted list of external communication frequencies. The progress bar on the screen crawled forward with excruciating slowness. 10%. 40%. Julian watched the percentage climb while keeping his suppressed pistol aimed at the retreating operators. 80%. The concrete wall behind the drill began to groan loudly under massive pressure. 100%. The transfer finally finished. A massive, deafening crack suddenly split the main concrete foundation wall. The thick steel supports buckled inward. A massive, high-pressure jet of dark ocean water blasted violently into the chamber. The freezing water level rose instantly, carrying heavy debris, sharp rocks, and large wooden supply crates. The three enemy operators abandoned their expensive equipment and ran frantically toward a secondary escape shaft located behind the command center. Thorne had already vanished. Julian yanked his data cable free and secured his device. He turned quickly toward the dark exit tunnel. The freezing water already swirled around his heavy boots, rising rapidly toward his knees. "Duke, let us go!" Julian shouted loudly over the deafening roar of the incoming flood. The German shepherd immediately released the subdued, struggling mastiff. Duke sprinted toward his master. The two loyal partners ran side by side, plunging back into the dark, narrow drainage pipe. They sprinted as fast as they physically could. They ran through the narrow tunnel, their boots splashing heavily in the rising water. The current grew stronger every single second. The cold water grabbed at Julian's legs, trying to pull him down into the dark abyss. Duke swam powerfully when the water reached his chest, his strong paws paddling furiously. They navigated the tight curves of the pipe entirely by memory and the faint green glow of Julian's night vision goggles. The violent sound of crashing concrete and rushing water echoed loudly behind them, acting as a terrifying reminder of the total destruction chasing them back to the surface. Julian's chest burned for oxygen as he pushed through the rising floodwater. The narrow drainage pipe amplified the terrifying sound of the ocean surging violently behind them. The freezing current tore at his legs, actively threatening to sweep him backward into the collapsing underground chamber. Duke swam powerfully at his side. The brave German shepherd held his large head high above the dark, churning surface. They fought against the heavy drag of the water for 20 agonizing minutes. The physical toll was immense. Julian felt his muscles cramping from the intense cold, but he refused to slow his pace. Finally, the faint green glow of his night vision goggles revealed the rusted iron rungs of the ladder leading up to the abandoned warehouse district. Julian grabbed the wet metal and pulled himself out of the freezing current. He reached down and hauled Duke up by the thick tactical harness handle. The rising water level rushed past their boots, filling the lower pipe completely. Julian climbed the ladder rapidly. He pressed his shoulders firmly against the heavy iron manhole cover. He pushed upward with every ounce of remaining strength in his exhausted body. The metal disc scraped loudly against the concrete rim and slid sideways. Julian climbed out onto the cracked asphalt and pulled Duke up beside him. They collapsed onto the wet ground, gasping violently for the cold night air. Julian did not rest for more than 10 seconds. He forced himself to stand. He needed to secure the digital data immediately. He reached into his waterproof chest pouch and pulled out a specialized encrypted satellite communicator. He connected the data cable from his digital optic device directly to the transmitter port. He activated the heavy device. He entered a highly classified Priority 0 emergency code. The signal connected directly to the Central Command Center at Naval Special Warfare Command in Coronado. Julian did not wait for a voice response. He initiated a massive data burst transmission. He sent the high-definition video footage of the tunnel, the clear audio recording of the sabotage plan, and the complete operational blueprints he had downloaded from the guard's tablet. He attached a single critical text message to the packet. The message read, "Federal breach aborted. Target is Elias Thorne. He is alive. He is hostile. Data contains his primary escape vectors." The digital progress bar filled the small green screen. Julian watched it intently as the numbers climbed. The transmission completed successfully. The secure device wiped its own memory instantly. Julian disconnected the cables and packed the equipment away. He looked down at Duke. The brave dog stood shaking the cold water from his thick coat. Julian knelt and wrapped his arms tightly around the dog's neck. They had survived the immediate threat. Now, Julian needed to let the vast military machine do its job. He knew Thorne's exact tactical mindset. Thorne would not fight a lost battle. He would immediately utilize his primary maritime escape route. Julian and Duke retreated to the roof of the abandoned brick warehouse. They watched the city skyline from the high vantage point. The military response arrived with terrifying speed and overwhelming force. Less than 15 minutes after the transmission, the dark sky above San Diego filled with the heavy thumping of rotor blades. 3 black, unmarked helicopters flew incredibly low over the bay, running completely dark without navigation lights. Dozens of black SUVs swarmed the streets surrounding the Federal Intelligence Complex, rapidly blocking every possible exit. Armed federal agents and elite tactical teams established a massive, impenetrable perimeter. Julian monitored the police and military emergency frequencies on his handheld radio. He listened to the precise, professional chatter of the strike teams. They located the flooded tunnel entrance. They secured the federal facility foundation. Then, the radio chatter shifted focus to the local marina. Thorne had attempted to escape using a high-speed submersible watercraft hidden beneath a civilian yacht. The downloaded data packet had specifically highlighted that exact extraction point. Heavily armed SEAL operators intercepted Thorne on the wooden docks before he could deploy the vessel. The radio confirmed the high-value target was in federal custody. The rogue commander had finally fallen. The underground network was entirely dismantled. The immediate threat to national security and to the quiet residential neighborhood evaporated into the night air. The next morning arrived with a bright, warm California sun. The residential suburb looked exactly the same as it always did. The green lawns sat perfectly manicured. The sprinklers hissed loudly in the early morning quiet. Children walked past the wooden fences with heavy backpacks, laughing and talking with their friends. A mail carrier slowly drove down the street, dropping letters into metal boxes. Nobody on the street had any idea how close they had come to total catastrophe. They did not know about the massive flooded tunnel buried deep beneath their driveways. They did not know a war had raged silently beneath their beds. Julian sat in a wooden chair on his back porch. He held a hot mug of black coffee in his hands. He wore clean, comfortable clothes. His tactical gear was securely locked away in the heavy steel locker in the garage. The physical bruises and exhausted muscles ached deeply, but his mind felt incredibly clear. The heavy, suffocating weight that had crushed his chest since returning from his last deployment was completely gone. He had finally found his anchor. He looked down. Duke lay peacefully on the warm wooden deck boards directly next to Julian's boots. The German shepherd rested his large, scarred chin on his front paws. The dog closed his amber eyes and let out a long, contented sigh. Julian reached down and gently rubbed the thick fur behind Duke's ears. The dog leaned heavily into the touch, fully relaxing his strong muscles. They were 2 broken soldiers who had found exactly what they needed in each other. They had faced the ghosts of the past and won. They had protected the innocent people sleeping quietly around them. Julian took a slow sip of his coffee. He watched the morning sun rise higher into the clear blue sky. For the first time in a very long time, Julian felt like he was truly home. Julian and Duke's story is a powerful reminder that true heroes do not always wear a uniform on a distant battlefield. Sometimes the greatest courage is found in the quiet moments of our everyday lives, and deep healing often comes from the unbreakable bond between a man and a faithful dog. From my perspective, their journey shows that even in our darkest times, when we feel lost or broken, God provides us with unexpected companions to guide us back to the light and give us a new purpose. May God bless you and your loved ones with safety, peace, and the courage to stand strong against any darkness in your own lives. If you believe in the power of faith and the incredible bond between humans and animals, please type Amen in the comments below. If this story inspired you, please share it with your friends and family. Leave a comment to let us know your thoughts, and do not forget to subscribe to our channel for more incredible stories of loyalty and courage.